Welcome to the Cove Podcast, your stop for PME on the go.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen, or afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, whenever you're listening. Welcome back to the Cove Podcast. I'm Captain Todd Lemper. In today's episode, we're going to talk about, it's not Operation Paladin, it's more broader than that. That's just the name of the operation that we're going to go into. But the idea of this episode is to provide contemporary operational experience from those who are on the ground. My guest today, or my guest, Captain Rhys Turner, is currently posted as the Divisional Officer at Australian Defence Force Academy with me, and then MAJ Mick Evans, who's currently posted as a Senior Instructor at the Royal Military College. Welcome, gents.
Hey, thanks very much.
Thanks, Todd.
So you both recently, so the idea of being on this podcast is that you both recently returned from Paladin over there for, how long was your deployment?
We were both there for 12 months, so we deployed in July 2024, July 2023, and returned July 2024.
And I suppose 12 months is a long time. We'll get to that in a second, particularly when we talk about coming back, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But I suppose for you, sir, do you want to just describe what Paladin is? I can talk about what UNTSO stands for and stuff, but what is Paladin?
I guess in the most simplistic terms, Paladin, by the book or by the brochure, is very much Australia's contribution to the UN mission in both Syria, Israel and Lebanon. And from an Australian perspective, it very much maintains a presence within the UN amongst the other missions that we do have as well. That's probably concise enough, I think, yeah.
I think I left this better in the intro, but we're not going to talk about Mazurka and the Sinai. That's outside the scope of this, and obviously an awesome another episode, but not something that you can talk to in personal experience. But this is about Israel, Lebanon and Syria from those that were on the ground. I suppose, Rhys, do you want to start by giving us a quick ground brief, for lack of a better term, as to where you were situated, but more broadly, the context behind the region, I suppose, just geographically?
Yep, so for myself, I deployed to Israel originally and I spent 7 months here. The majority of my time was spent at observation posts on the border of Israel and Syria. So we're in these observation posts with either one or two other people, and we'd be there for a period of 7 to 14 days at a time. We also conducted patrols and inspections on the Israel side just to check and count the weapons that they have within their bases within the area of limitation. From there, I then moved across to Lebanon and spent 5 months in Lebanon. So while I was there, we were living in a small little town of Tyre, which is a beautiful tourist hotspot at the best of time when there isn't a war going on. And then I was working on the Blue Line in southern Lebanon. So what we were doing would be pushed out to a large base that was occupied by UNIFIL personnel, about 150 people on the base. And then every day we'd go out and conduct patrols along the Blue Line, which is the border between Israel and Lebanon.
A little bit of a different perspective, but very much on the ground. What was your sort of, where were you located and what was your job over there?
Yeah, so I was located in Syria for the entirety of my 12 months. And I genuinely say that was a blessing, and it's something that I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to have had done for that period of time in such a unique place. Physically on the ground, I was based out of Camp Foire, which is approximately 20 kilometres off the area of separation, and approximately an hour southwest of Damascus itself. Day to day would see us moving up and down kind of the length of the area of separation, and in essence looking across that area at Rhys on the other side of the border in Israel, or Israeli-occupied Golan anyway. But I guess the most interesting part is that part of the world, especially in southwest Syria itself, is very much the birthplace of both the Syrian civil war and in many contexts is the birthplace of ISIS to a degree as well. And there are just ghosts all around that part of the world that are just so deep in history, and you go from town to town. It is very tribal, and when you're trying to set the scene, it is very much a different world to what anyone here could possibly experience or expect. But between the people and the places that we got to be exposed to, and having the freedom to be able to go to places like Damascus as well every weekend, is an unreal experience. Syria is a very unique place, and even to this day, it is changing daily. So. I was very blessed, like I said, to have the 12 months there and grateful for every moment.
You said blessed, and then also you said lucky to be there. I suppose from a perspective, like from an outsider looking in, I haven't deployed there. So like Syria, I would imagine, is the most dangerous component of that triangle that we're talking about, which is Lebanon, Syria and in Israel. So you're saying lucky and blessed to be in the most sort of the highest threat environment is my arbitrary understanding. What are the day-to-day conditions? What is it like to live in Syria for 12 months? That's a huge swing.
12 months is a long time. I think we'll talk more to the time of the deployment, or the duration of the deployment anyway. And I guess on paper, Syria is very easily to perceive as, yes, the most dangerous on paper. And I'd be interested to hear what Rhys has to say, but I'd very much say off the back of my time there, whilst there is a great deal of instability in the government, and that's obviously developing to this day, I wouldn't consider Syria, if we're looking at kind of those trinity of countries, I wouldn't consider Syria as being the most dangerous. I would probably throw that mantle across the border to Lebanon, and especially over the period that we were there as well. Syria is a very poor country, and it is very stable from a governmental perspective. However, the people themselves are extremely proud to be Syrian, not necessarily as a representative of their government or any stretch, but just to be Syrian. And to that end, they are so welcoming. And I think we have to put it in perspective as well that, the UN mission there has been there for now 77 years now, if we took over this year. So the vast majority of people in these countries have only ever seen white cars driving around, have only ever seen multinational organisations in and around their backyards. So for the most part, there were absolutely instances of concerns around safety, but no, on paper, yes, I understand that, and that's very much how I understood it as well, but I don't see that as being so much the case. But I would be interested from Rhys's perspective if that changed over his time as well.
We talked about you looking at from one observation post to the other and basically looking at each other. I mean, I remember being in Jordan and looking across the Jordan River, which is like a creek basically. But there was, Jordanian sort of military on one side and Israel military on the other, with flags hoisted as high as they could, as large as they could, to try to beat each other. But they're literally 10 metres from one another, looking across this Jordanian River at the site where Jesus was baptised. I suppose it wasn't that close. And sort of how far off Syria were you in that observation post? But more so, how was Lebanon?
So for me, in the observation posts, some of the observation posts in Israeli-occupied Golan are actually in Syrian territory. There are essentially 44-gallon drums across the border of the country, and that is what marks the boundary between the two countries, obviously noting that Israeli-occupied Golan is not actually internationally recognised as being Israeli territory. I think for additional context, for the Australian contingent, there are 12 Australian peacekeepers deployed to the region at a time on Operation Paladin, and these people rotate in on a 6-monthly basis in January and July each year. And speaking to the point that MAJ Evans spoke about in terms of where is viewed as the most dangerous area, I think the majority of us that were going over at the time wanted to go to Syria, as this was viewed as the location that was going to have the most amount of danger, or at least be the most interesting location and somewhere that you're least likely to go back in the future. And once we actually got there and things changed within the region, I know myself, I was very grateful for my opportunity in Israel, but also equally grateful of having the opportunity in Lebanon as well.
We're going to go forward and talk about what happened when you were there, because you were there at a pivotal time. But I want to walk back a little bit just to really disturb the flow and talk about your preparations before you went in. So you obviously get sledged for a deployment far in advance, and you're very deliberate and you know exactly where you're going. What sort of preparations? So we talked about white cars before. I remember in Jordan the same, like UN vehicles driving around. It's black tape on a white Prado basically. So we know we're going in to man OPs, to sit on OPs, observation posts, and we know that we're going to be in white Land Cruisers or the equivalent. What preparation do you have before you go in?
Yep, so the first part of the preparation process is firstly the Force Preparation course run out of 39 OSB in Sydney. And this is essentially Defence's way of certifying that someone is ready to deploy on a operation. At the conclusion of that, we then went to the Peace Operations Training Centre here in Canberra, and then that is essentially where we conducted our UN-specific training.
Did you do it together? Was that the...
We did. Yeah, we did.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
So the majority of us who deployed in July 23, we're all there together, which was a great opportunity to actually build the team before we went over there. But there was occasions where some people that were there with for the 6-month period that had got there before us, we didn't actually get to physically meet them until we got home a couple months later, which was quite an interesting experience in itself. So we were at the Peace Operations Training Centre, which was an excellent opportunity to work with some other countries. A lot of our nations, a lot of our partners send people as a part of that course and have done several UN missions before as well. That also concludes a bit of a field phase where we go through some of the situations that we're likely to see.
You don't mean field phase like we're going through now with RMC and ADFA, you mean like...
Absolutely not. It is a short 12-hour day out at Majura training area and going through some stability type operations, some scenarios, and then working through that in the team. And then once we finished that, we then conducted a four-wheel drive course, which is probably one of the most enjoyable courses I've actually done in defence, where we went and got some dedicated four-wheel drive training with Vic Widman, which was a personal highlight of the preparation for myself.
Just before we do push on now, Rhys, you're known as having the softest hands at ADFA, but for Major Evans, I suppose a question, how was Rhys with the physical component and also driving and anything mechanical?
We took it very slowly, but to be fair, I do recall that you walked away as student of merit on that course, and with a job offer from Vic himself. So short of any administrative action coming out of his time as a DO now, he's got a soft place to land with Vic. So
soft hands, quick learner though.
Absolutely, a true highlight, and definitely better than Dean Nicole, one of the other individuals that we were there with at the time.
So yeah, you do some driver training, you do some stability operations out at Majura. Good to get back out there, I suppose, and some nostalgia. And then obviously you, I suppose, punch in. How do you fly into the location? Is it Civière or do you fly in? And sort of what's the reception like?
We flew in by civilian means, and it was all pretty normal. There are a few tensions that are going through immigration and clearances and the like, but otherwise it was relatively seamless, and then getting picked up by a couple of our Australian counterparts on the other side in Israel, in Jerusalem itself. It was good to have, I guess, a friendly face and a well-informed face to receive us on that end. Our arrival was obviously pre-conflict, which I think was good because it gave us all a bit of an opportunity to bed in outside of any sort of duress, I guess. And we had 2 weeks in Jerusalem, I think it was, and I guess that initial training with the UN and the headquarters there largely covered integration, familiarisation with UN operations more broadly, a little bit of driver training, noting that everything for us flipped from a right side drive to a left side, and that took a little bit of mental pathing to make that happen. But otherwise, I think for me anyway, and I know that POTC have done a lot of work to keep their courses going, but yeah, I genuinely do think that the training that we received, I don't personally feel that it prepared me quite well enough to what we walked into and eventually where it went as well. Yeah. We were very much exposed to how to interact with people and how to operate vehicles in a UN manner, if you'd like. But I don't think any of that genuinely prepared me for the kind of work that we would actually be doing, and how we would be integrating more broadly in that environment with a whole bunch of different nations as well. So, but I think that comes back to now the responsibility of Rhys and myself and others in our position to link back in with POTC, for instance, and make sure that we are getting around the courses that they are running now to keep part and activities like this as well, right? So,
I suppose, what were those things that you were like, not ill prepared for, but like what were the things that really you wish you had more training on? And what things did you do that you wished you had more time, prep? I'm not talking about going into absolute conflict, which we'll get to in a minute, but like more so from the initial sense. What were the things that you were doing that you thought that you probably needed a bit more practice before you got there?
POTC did a really good job of administratively preparing people to, integrate into the UN environment, I guess. But where I felt that I was vastly underprepared, and this is probably I'm naming and shaming myself a little bit here as well, but was just understanding of the region, understanding of actual UN operations and how they integrate with those three countries in particular where we were going. The course itself, I think, that POTC run is relatively generalist. It's not specific to country more so. And I felt like that took a little bit of time for myself anyway to get to the point where I was, okay, like I'm covering the gaps that I feel like I should have walked in here in the first instance.
And same race. Do you feel the same or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think before I went over there, I didn't realise just how complex the history of between the countries is, and I didn't realise that until I was there and seeing things on the ground and walking around a place like Jerusalem and getting to understand the religious histories and how they differ so much between the different religions.
Yeah, I remember still we went to, in a completely different context and experience, we went to Jordan, Israel, into the West Bank just for holidays while we were at ADFA. But completely different time. But you just walk around thinking, this is literally I will never understand this. It is so complex. The whole conflict itself, but more so the geopolitical context within the region is wild.
Absolutely. So, and that's probably a really good lead into what happened from once we finished in Jerusalem. So for myself, I went on a bus and went to a town called Tiberias. This is the headquarters for Observer Group Golan Tiberias. And from there, we conducted about 14 days of introduction training to bring us up to date with the current TTPs and SOPs that are rolling within the specific outstation. And this is a really good opportunity to start building the networks with the other observers who were there and getting to actually understand what the situation is on the ground. Because as much as you could research it before, I didn't feel like it was actually adequate to understand how things were going to work and actually understand the job that I was going to be doing until I conducted that introduction training. I know for the people going to Lebanon at the time, they went on a bus from Israel into Lebanon, and then once the conflict started, that crossing between the two countries closed on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, and it changed a lot, didn't it? For me, when we kind of left Jerusalem, I think I was on the same bus as you actually, and we rolled through Tiberias, dropped them off, and then we kept going towards the border another hour and a bit with Syria, and that was an unreal experience. It's probably something that I never could have possibly prepared myself for, because where the crossing is at a town called Al-Qanetra. And if you go back to the war in the 70s there, this town was largely levelled and still very much is in the exact same state right now. So I remember arriving at the border and were there for an uncomfortably long time with the Israeli Defence Force, just kind of monitoring the border there. And eventually they open the gate, and it's more or less the UN bus at the time dropping us off with a UN vehicle on the Syrian border to pick us up. And there was 3 of us that made that crossing on that day, and we literally just walked across what is in essence the DMZ, if you'd like, or the area of separation. It's a couple hundred metres that we just walked across from Israeli-occupied Golan into Syria. And on the other side, I remember being met by, we've just left the Israeli Defence Force, maybe a platoon-sized group at the border that are in full kit. And then on the other side, on the Syrian border, it's kind of the first time you see the Syrian flag, and you walk through their gate, and there's one individual in civilians and sandals, and we start exploding our kit out. And it's like within the space of a few hundred metres, you've gone back in time. It was a very, very surreal experience. And then the drive from there to Camp Foire, another kind of 30 minutes down the road, and you're just driving through abandoned town after abandoned town, and just destruction everywhere. It was surreal.
And would you pin to the windows, right? Because you'd just be looking at trying to take everything in, because it's like, this is so fascinating.
Yeah, pin to the windows, no phones, and you're just trying to take it in, but it's impossible. Like the visual stimulus that is coming in is just it is hard to describe. And anyone familiar with the history, you could find these images quite easily, but to be there and to drive through it, noting that became my workplace for the next 12 months is a different thing. But that first instance is just, nothing you could have done would have prepared me for that. So,
and I suppose, sorry, Rhys, you got a point?
And I think it's actually quite a good comparison between the 2 or the 3 countries. For us in Israel and Lebanon, we were based in residential rentals, whereas for Major Evans and the other people in Syria, they were actually based on a military base of Camp Foire. So that entire experience in itself is quite different. Us going home to a home after a stint out on the OP compared to going back to a military base at night is quite a difference between the operations that I experienced versus what Major Evans experienced as well.
Yeah, it must be nice, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm going to dwell on that point because it seems to distinguish you now. Rhys is having an awesome time. But you get there, you talked about OP, and I want you to describe what it actually was. Like we know what an observation post is, but what physically was it? But more from the other side, where were you living? It's in a share house, like with all these people, and like what's it sort of, I suppose, what are your living conditions? And then I'll throw back to Major Evans after that.
Yep. So for us in Israel, we're staying in a share house with 5 other people. So there was a couple of Australians, someone from the Netherlands and someone from New Zealand as well. And we'd stay there when we weren't on the observation post. Out of the observation post, we would be there with 1 or 2 other people, and it is essentially a couple of small buildings together that have been there since the mission started many, many years ago. And it would consist of a very small kitchen, a couple of bedrooms, a very basic gym, and a tower which had good observation into the area of separation or between the border of Israel and Syria.
And then I suppose back to you, sir, like are you throwing your dive bag onto a stretcher in a canvas tent, or what's the sort of conditions in Syria?
No, it's not as dire as that. It's not quite as comfortable as that either. But no, I think it's a very well-established camp, and not to take anything away from it. Like we weren't uncomfortable. I'll be very honest. We weren't uncomfortable. The accommodation for us was made up of a couple of hard standing buildings or just demountables. Generally, kind of 4 rooms to a demountable. And a couple of shared bathrooms, like very, very basic stuff. But at the same time, when you put it into perspective of where we were and what we were there to do, very livable at the same time. So I don't think, you could have your personal gripes about the kind of conditions, I guess, that we had at times. But at the same time, it could have been a lot worse. So the mission's old and it's established enough to sustain itself in that respect, yeah.
So I won't go into rules of engagement per se, but obviously there is a strict set of rules that, or strict or sometimes really laissez-faire, but applied to you when you go to each nation, and host nations apply some things, the general just population apply others. I suppose what were you told to do with the local population, and then how did that local population, I suppose, change throughout the conflict?
Within Israel, we were very much a part of the population. We would go to the shops, we would go out for dinner in normal clothes, and we would definitely get some funny looks speaking English. But overall, they were pretty welcoming. That definitely changed a little bit as the conflict progressed, and they were a bit more suspicious of UN personnel. But overall, no real issues. Within Lebanon in particular, when we were out on patrols, we would stop at local restaurants for lunch and have conversations there. And that was a really good way for us to get information about what was going on within the specific area or within the region. And we had a language assistant there to help. Something that was quite interesting was our interaction with the refugee population within southern Lebanon. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's more than 2 million refugees within Lebanon from mostly Syria and Palestinians as well. And they are in refugee camps all across southern Lebanon with small tents and plastic, and we would be driving past them every day. And for myself personally, being in the UN, before going over there, I thought we were really there to help and really make a difference. But what I saw on the ground was the issue was so large and the scale of it was so large that we were actually unable to have any sort of interaction or make a real difference to the refugee population in particular.
And I suppose on the Syrian side, Lebanon sort of somewhat permissive, but still struggling with that ability or inability to help at all times, sort of thing. But I suppose, so on the Syrian side, what were your interactions with the locals supposed to be like, and how did it unfold?
I think if you look at Syria as a well of money, and if Damascus is the centre, then as you get further away from Damascus, the poorer it got. And you don't have to go far before you start really seeing those effects. So Damascus itself, honestly, pretty affluent in parts. You could tell the rich Syrians, that they are well looked after. But in terms of our operating environment themselves, though, it's an extremely poor country, beyond what you would kind of immediately think when you kind of hear those words, to the point where you have, we were directed by the Syrian government at that point, and to this day, that at no point were we to interact with any of the locals. So whenever we went out on patrol, we would be in our up armoured cars that are heavily soundproofed, if you'd like. So I can't hear anything outside, definitely can't smell anything outside, like you would just the car. Then as you're on patrol, you'll have kids that are jumping out in front of the cars, and naturally you obviously stop when they're there, kind of shaking their hand, indicating, hey, give us water, and you just kind of have to wave and try and move them on, and they'll just stand in front of the car. And for me, having 2 young girls, and these are girls, boys, it didn't matter. That was really hard, because they know who you are, and they know that you are well and truly looked after from a UN perspective. So to kind of have to just wave them on and not be able to react or obviously give them anything that they clearly need is difficult in itself. And you know, we've talked about the mental bill, I guess, for going on something like one of these operations. And you know, there are other instances where, you know, there were other Australians that were there with Rhys and I, you know, who during the conduct, just their observation from an OP tower itself, looking back into Syrian territory. There were a couple of kids that were moving through one of the fields and they detonated a mine. And we found out later that day that both of those two kids died, obviously as a result of their injuries. And you have one of our peers who observed this in real time. And then obviously the aftermath, which is that entire town that was near that come out and, you know, go through the process of, you know, claiming the bodies and et cetera. And for that individual to be there at the tower and just observe, and that's it, because that was our job, right? That is difficult, and that's difficult to even to receive when kind of decompressing with him at that point in time. And there are other instances when the Iranian wave of missiles went overhead later on in the conflict, where there are our personnel, our peers that are on the tower and live kind of updates coming through as to this is coming. And at the same time, you know that this is coming, you know, just hundreds of drones, hundreds of missiles coming over the top of your head because, you know, Iran, Syria, Israel, in terms of that order, and the pending response from Israel as well. Like these are all mental checks that have to be paid at some point. And you know, little things like that, I think get kind of lost in the noise of your day-to-day activities. And unfortunately, and it's sad kind of hearing myself talk about this now, because you go, well, I sound like I'm talking about this pretty normally, but these are not normal things that people kind of just park in the back of their minds and bring home and just carry on with life, right? So, but yeah, interesting experiences all the same.
And I suppose you're stuck in the middle, like the common thread across your sort of stories with the deployment is that you're stuck in the middle and then being told you can't do anything. I imagine like when a kid pulls in front of you, you grab them for the door handle to open the door and step out, right? That's the normal, like to be like, oh, jump off the road or like have a chat or something. And you just can't do that.
No, and you're exactly right. Like there is just like doors are locked because there are plenty of instances of doors being pulled open and things being taken historically across the mission itself. But doors are locked, and to know that that's the degree of separation that we have from this kid that's standing in front of your, you know, 3-4 ton car is unreal. And they know that you'll stop. And they'll stand there until something's got to give eventually. And usually, ironically enough, it's one of the adults that typically kind of rip them out of the way. But all the same, it doesn't kind of make the impact any less, I guess.
And that's also something that we saw in Lebanon, just probably in a different way, that our interaction with the community was a lot larger. And at times you definitely built relationships with these types of people. And for one of the other teams, I conducted a patrol with them in a different area of operations, and we occupied a temporary observation post on top of a house. And next to the house was one that had been destroyed a couple of weeks ago. And the team was telling me about how they would normally go to this temporary observation post and they would go and have coffee and tea with the family that lived in this house that had now been destroyed. And something like that was quite a interesting experience to see what sort of impact that had, because you build these relationships and then all of a sudden this family has to move somewhere else. Their livelihood's gone because it's been destroyed in an artillery strike or in an airstrike. And it's places that we became very comfortable in going there on a very, very regular basis, and we couldn't go there anymore. And there was towns within southern Lebanon that driving through them absolutely looked like a war zone and looked like places in Gaza. And for myself, going over there, before I went over there, that was something that I didn't think that I would experience or get to see. But driving through them and seeing the level of destruction was quite an eye-opening experience, and something that I suppose probably took me a little bit of time to come to terms with myself, as this being a result of the conflict that all the parties were participating in directly.
I suppose that's so you bedded in, you find your workplace, you go home, you have the tensions of a share house, or Rhys does anyway, and then sort of we're all set. So we're thinking, or we're going into this deployment thinking that it's going to be long established and the same as it's always been. I suppose the elephant in the room now is what happens when that changes. I suppose who wants to talk first about their experience as the rockets fly, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, so I'll speak about my experience first. So 7th of October, I was at Observation Post 51, which is observing directly into Syria from Israeli-controlled territory on the Golan. And it was early in the morning, about 7 a.m, and we start getting news reports that rockets have been fired from Palestinian territory into Israel. And from there, this isn't necessarily, it is somewhat rare, but we could quickly tell that the sheer volume of it suggested that this was a more significant incident than we'd been exposed to over the last couple of months there. And over the course of the morning, these reports continued to come in to, I believe it reached to a point where they were saying that there was over 5,000 rockets fired from both the West Bank and from Gaza into Israel.
Was there a tendency to we have a pretty laissez-faire approach, but was there a tendency to be like, nah, I think it's still normal? At what point did you reach the point where you're like, nah, this is actually different?
I think we realised pretty early on that this was a significant situation and something quite out of the normal. The probably issue on the ground was that it didn't actually change our operations at all. We continued conducting our observation into the area of separation. And this is one of those interesting times when the UN isn't actually prepared to deal with something like that, because UNTSO in particular, that isn't their mission to observe the peace between Palestinian territory and Israel. It's there to observe the peace between the other countries. So as a result, we continued observing across the border. And on that day where I was, it was extremely quiet. There was nothing out of the ordinary that I saw from my experience. And I think that was relatively similar across the entire of the UNTSO area of operations. And then from there, things started to change.
I think obviously, it's been long established, but the threat probably wasn't. It hasn't been like that. But when sort of family and friends, are they sending? Do you have comms back to Australia? And are they sending messages through, being like, "I'm looking at all of the news feed," because they track it. Your mum and dad track it very closely. But are they sending you messages, being like, "What's going on? Like, are you safe?" and all that sort of stuff at that point?
I think personally, because of the time difference, I was able to get on the front foot and send some messages back home and try and comfort the family that the things that were going on were not in my immediate area of operations, and trying to explain that to a non-military family was quite challenging. But through some tough conversations, a video call, and obviously very lucky to have that sort of technology at the moment, made it a lot easier to, I suppose, calm things down back home so I could worry about doing the job on the ground.
I suppose to shift tack to Syria now, I suppose, so what was your perspective as the conditions completely changed?
Well, to be brutally honest, my perspective was I was comfortably back in Australia at that point on leave. So, but that in itself was a huge challenge because you mentioned just before about the media and the feeds that were coming in, and then question marks of, am I actually going to be able to get back into country to do my job? Started rising, and there was a lot of uncertainty, an incredible amount of uncertainty. But even though I wasn't physically there on the day, I think I was only a week behind before I got back. But that first week, I very much remember it was quiet. It was quiet, and geographically we're well removed from Gaza and where the October 7, I guess the start point happened. It wasn't until probably, I would say maybe week 3, week 4 that we really started to seeing some changes, especially from posturing with the Israeli Defence Force in and around our area as a result of what was going on in Gaza. So coming back into country was a very bizarre experience, and especially as a very white Australian, taking that connecting flight from Dubai through to Lebanon, which was my means of getting back into Syria. Very, very empty plane at that point in time, given everything that was going on in the region. Very empty plane. There's a very military-looking individual in myself on that plane, and it was a nervous plane ride. But fortunately, got back into Syria and across the border in good order. And like I said, I don't think it was until probably week 3, week 4 that we really started noticing some changes across that area of separation between Syria and Rhys on the other side in Israeli-occupied Golan.
And I suppose your infill, so different. So through Golan into Syria the first time, now you've completely shifted. Your sort of drop-off point is Lebanon, and then back through, I suppose, are completely different. Yeah,
so what was, I guess, the pre-war movement was always going to be preferred as going through Israel and out. very quickly changed to all movement was by ground, obviously through the border with Lebanon and out of Beirut, and that maintained for the remainder of our time there, and probably to this day as well, without knowing exactly right now, but I'm assuming it's the same still. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're back when that three week mark where you said that things change. You're back in the hot seat doing your job.
Yeah. So by the time I got back, I think I had another month or so as an observer. Before I then switched jobs, which we can get to in a bit. But that last month and kind of week 3 onwards was, we really started to notice, I guess, the posturing and the nervousness of the Israeli Defence Force on everyone that was kind of on their northern border with Lebanon, and then obviously on their eastern border with Syria. They became very outwards looking, and understandably so as well, right? But it created a lot of tension when you have a host nation in the Israelis posturing like that, and an organisation like the UN who is blindly trying to maintain a status quo, almost to the point of ignorance, I would say, in trying to achieve their outcomes, made it very, very complex and nervous, I guess, between the two organisations, being Israel and the UN writ large.
And then, Rhys, I suppose that first 3 weeks, as it unfolds, how does it change for you? What sort of things change for you?
Yep. So for me, for those first 3 weeks, the first 7 days from October 7th, I was stuck on the observation post. So I had very limited observation of what was actually occurring in Israel. After those 7 days, when I got off the observation post, I essentially saw the complete mobilisation of a country. And coming from Australia, of what is a relatively small military, it was very interesting to observe exactly what that looked like. And from the Australians, we were trying to figure out roughly when they would go into Gaza and trying to put our logistics plans hat on and try and figure that sort of information out. But what we saw was the complete mobilisation, where they called up over 300,000 reservists within a 7-day period.
And you're in Israel, living in a house at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So we lived in a private rental, and our landlord downstairs, who was over 55 years old, he was called up to the military, back to service. And you'd be driving around town, going out to the observation post, and you would see convoys of tanks, armoured vehicles, artillery being moved around the country. And on us, we were trying to make assessments about where they were going to get an understanding or make an assessment about what Israel's next moves were likely to be.
That's insane. So,
I was just going to say, I think that's a really good inflection because, the mobilisation by Israel at that point was incredible, and from an Australian contingent perspective, and our reporting just went through the roof, and all these sort of things were being observed. And interestingly, on the other side of the border in Syria, whilst all that is happening in Israel, there's not a change in pattern of life whatsoever. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about the nervousness. Is you have this very modern fighting force in Israel looking across the border at what they consider to be a significant threat in Syria, and there are tanks and mechanised vehicles there that haven't moved in decades and didn't move as a response or in response to anything that happened on October 7 or beyond. So it was really interesting hearing what they were seeing, and then you look around on my side of the border and go, there is no movement here. It was bizarre. And
I think this is a really interesting comparison between Israel and the Australian Defence Force in particular, where for Israel in particular, they know what they're training for, and all of their training is regarding what is going on in the region.
Very specific threat. I suppose that's the critiques of the current strategy in the past, is that it wasn't specific. I suppose Israel has a very specific threat.
Yeah, absolutely. So on their equivalent of COAC, they rehearse these sorts of things and they do shoots on these actual activities. And from myself being a S4 within 214, the Armoured Regiment, seeing that from the Australian perspective of how difficult it was to deploy with civilian assets over weeks to Shoalwater Bay, over 8 hours away, compared to Israel deploying essentially their whole military across 100 kilometres, and how they were able to do that within a 7 to 21-day period was absolutely fascinating, and shows how the mobilisation is able to work at that high level.
I think it's difficult for us to fathom because there's a lot of sea, right? We have a lot of sea involved, whereas it's all land crossings, I imagine. There is some it's less restrictive, I suppose, or more permissive, to use the correct English. But so say you're in your share house. I'm really dumbing it down now, but you're in your share house and you're seeing literally like military vehicles advancing towards the border, or just more activity. I suppose what unfolds next as you're trying to guess what the plan is?
So something that sort of was a change, and something in Israel that they have, is an application on your phone, and it gives you a notification if there is rockets coming to your region. Something like that is very difficult to comprehend within Australia, and something I wasn't aware was even a thing in Israel. But as soon as we arrived on the ground, we were told to download this app, and it happened very rarely, but there is bomb shelters in everywhere, around everywhere in Israel, and the alarm on your phone will go off if there are rockets that are coming in. Fortunately for me, I had this very rarely in Israel.
And then I suppose on your side, so still no change. There's still you. I imagine you don't have the same app. You have no
such
ISR.
app. No.
Yeah. So where's the ISR? Is it predominantly like I don't want to go into the OPSEC stuff, but like, is it a lot of news-based stuff? And are you left in the dark a lot, or is it well established, the ISR feeds and the feedback?
Definitely not relying on UN ISR, that's for sure. The vast majority of, I guess, my situational awareness very much came from a collaborative Australian network that we had between the 3 different stations, and an incredible amount of work by all of the individuals over there to create this all-informed group of people. And for most of us, we took a lot of that information where appropriate and worked that into our UN considerations when we were moving around the AO. So in terms of an ISR piece, when we were in Syria, we didn't have SIM cards, for instance, for our phones. We were largely slave to static Wi-Fi nodes that were at the OPs or at the camp. So moving around from... we're relatively in a black spot for the duration of a car patrol, which might be 4 to 6 hours, for instance, and you are just on a radio like VHF communications with a CP back at camp. But the ability for them to effectively transfer, especially timely information as things change, is poor, which is a scary notion in itself. But that is years and years of habit and organisational culture that you're trying to inflict some change on, which is really hard.
And I suppose you talked about, Rhys, not really changing how you do business. Have we changed now? Is there any change? Are we getting nervous? Is there an uncertainty as to what's going to unfold? Like, what is the condition? Like, how's the feel?
So I think the vibe within the country, within Israel itself, of the local population was very concerned, and something that possibly doesn't get communicated very well on the Western media is just how supportive Israel was overall for the operations internal to Gaza. I know it obviously has a lot of interest from a lot of different countries, and there's a lot of issues with it, but internally to Israel, I would say overall people were very supportive of the operations that were occurring internally. I think for what sort of occurred once they actually conducted the invasion in Gaza was a normal pattern of life essentially was established across the UN operation, where there was regular cross-border incidents between Israel and Lebanon in particular, and very limited activity between Israel and Syria. And what it sort of looked like on the Israel to Syria side would be, on occasion, there would be indirect fire across the border, or tanks firing, or small arms firing across the border as well. But in terms of what the UN did, there was very limited change in operations, and overall there was some limited sort of evacuation planning and pulling the evacuation plan out of the cupboard. But in terms of the actual preparation itself for if things escalated and got significantly worse, in terms of a ground invasion conducted by Israel, there's very limited planning going on within the UN, in my perspective of what I was seeing on the ground, of that actually occurring.
Did that make you nervous? The fact that you didn't know where you were going if shit hit the fan? Like were you nervous at all? Or?
So within the Israel side there, and also Syria as well, the UNTSO observers support UNDOF, which is another UN operation, and there's roughly 1,000 armed peacekeepers there. And it's a really important distinction to make. Us as military observers, we are unarmed observers, whereas UNDOF in Israel and Syria, and then UNIFIL in Lebanon, they are armed observers. So we're essentially driving around in sometimes just normal Land Cruisers, or other times up-armoured Land Cruisers.
I suppose you talked about different organisations. I'll throw back to you, sir. Who are you working with? And then subsequently, I know when the Afghan, we started to pull out of Afghan, it started to get they're leaving, but we're staying. The Dutch are staying in, and there's a lot of politics in terms of who stays and who goes. I suppose with you, who did you work with, and was there anyone just pulling out?
No. So I guess in short, we didn't see anyone, and I think this goes back to Rhys's comment, the reaction from the UN, from October 7 onwards. Yeah, from the best part, you could go, oh, nothing's happened. Nothing's changed. It was business as usual in UNTSO's eyes, specific to that mission anyway. Despite conditions, especially on the Israeli side, despite conditions changing significantly, the upkick in interactions on the border with Lebanon changing significantly, and arguably on the border with Syria eventually changing. The UN operations are largely just like I said, just another day. In terms of who was there from a nationality perspective, so the UNTSO component is made up of 30-something contributing nations. So it's like ones and twos from all sorts of different countries, a lot of the Baltic nations, European, etc. And then from the UNDOF component, which are more contingent-based, there was a large Indian contingent there, a large Nepalese, and also an Irish contingent initially. The Irish eventually handed over to the very first Kazakh contingent that came into Syria as well.
Sorry, what's Kazakh?
The Kazakhstanis, sorry.
Oh, yep. I thought it was another funky acronym, but yeah, cool.
No, that is a country. No. And so the Kazakhs came in. They came in, I think it was late December. It was kind of on the turn of the year. It might have been a few months after that. But my point being, they came in the midst of the conflict. But their infill into Syria, etc., largely went unchanged, regardless of the conflict that was going on. So UN operations were not responsive, not reactive, and they very deliberately as well, tried to maintain, we're just going to keep doing business as usual, which I think is where a lot of, from an Australian perspective, a lot of nerves came from, trying to just, I probably should stop calling it ignorance, but it was very much a willingness just to try and maintain the norm.
And I suppose back to you, Rhys, we talked about 30 different nations. Who are you predominantly working with though?
So similar to what Major Evans said in terms of those countries, and I think I also experienced probably the largest change when I was in Lebanon. And within those countries, we had several people from the Asian countries, such as Bhutan, as well as some people from China as well, which was an interesting experience, noting that it's not very common that ADF personnel get to work with the Chinese, and there was also some Russian officers there as well. And that's probably a good segue for me to touch on my time in Lebanon as well, because I found this to be significantly different to my time in Israel, and Lebanon itself probably saw the most amount of change in terms of its operations there as well.
So when you say in Lebanon, do you mean that you would go out there for a swing, or did you shift locations?
So after 7 months in Israel, I deliberately shifted locations and moved to Lebanon. I had to conduct my introduction and training again for roughly 10 days, and then conducted the operations which were occurring in Lebanon. This was predominantly patrolling based. So we would go out for between 4 to 8 hours a day and conduct patrols along the blue line, which is Israel and Lebanon. And this was quite an interesting experience because the conflict was roughly 4 months old at this time, and what we were seeing on the ground was essentially a range of cross-border incidents, which is a violation of the United Nations Security Council resolution specific to the two countries. And this was generally sort of small arms, artillery, and on occasions airstrikes as well. And over the course of my 5 months there, this differed significantly in terms of intensity, from at times as low as 0 a day up to over 100 cross-border incidents a day.
Of mixed variation. You talked about small arms and okay. Are you seeing, so we talked about ground forces mobilising, right? Are you seeing like aircraft increase? Obviously, you probably can't see the rockets, but are you seeing like aircraft increase and the like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw on several different occasions fast jets going overhead and conducting a sonic boom or dropping flares overhead as well. And knowing that Lebanon does not have a functional air force with fast jets, it's very clear which country is sending those fast jets overhead. So that was definitely one component of it. And then on top of that, you did see an increase in posturing or alertness of the Israeli positions, because essentially how it looks on the ground on the Israel side, there is hundreds of different positions that look directly into Lebanon. And then within Lebanon, they have very limited military positions, but UNIFIL, which is a 10,000 strong military force, which is essentially there to observe the peace. They are armed observers. They have several different positions across the blue line as well. And this is from over 10 different countries, obviously being 10,000 people. It's quite a significant force, and they are also conducting observation, but they are less.
And sort of like, so we talked about more ground forces, more air, sort of stuff. Was there any funky that you saw that was just really weird? Like we talked about going supersonic, boom, yep, and dropping chaff or flares and stuff. But like, did you see anything that was like incredibly odd? And like from someone who doesn't observe, we go to RAF exercise and we see, aircraft flying all the time. But like, what's it like, I suppose? What sort of things did you see?
I think something that was quite interesting for me was the amount of ISR overhead, whether it was drones, and a lot of the times we couldn't see the drones, but you knew that they were there with constant ISR or persistent ISR. So that was quite interesting, as well as GPS jamming as well. So from almost the day that I got there until the day that I left, my phone always said that I was located in Beirut Airport. So if I was looking to do a run around base and update my Strava with what I was doing, it wouldn't work because it was saying I was running on the airfield or on the main runway in Beirut Airport. That was probably the most interesting thing, and quite a good experience to get that sort of good opportunity to get that experience, and seeing it firsthand and having to conduct planning around it and relying on the more rudimentary methods like a map to get around.
And if it's not on Strava, it didn't count, I suppose. Isn't that right, Rhys?
Absolutely.
Back to MAJ Evans, I suppose. We talk about that, talk about the observation of aircraft and ground forces increasing and stuff. Now, you got promoted, so went from observer for a moment, and then you're in the headquarters now. Do you want to talk about that shift? Not only that, we talked about how nervous I would be incredibly nervous, but the nerves at the time, shifting to the headquarters, what was that sort of like?
Making that change, I guess before I made that change I was fortunate enough to still spend probably a month or two as an observer, where I was actually able to be on the line and observe, especially the Israel change. And it's hard to describe, I guess, the feeling when you have. Because realistically, at points, the distance between, for instance, my OP and Rhys's OP on the Israeli occupied side is potentially, 5 to 10 kilometres maybe, not even that sometimes. So you can see very clearly the other OPs, and ironically enough, you can see very clearly the Israeli positions that are more often than not flanking the OPs as well. So it's unnerving when you see one of their Merkava tanks roll up onto the boundary fence and is in essence staring at you. Not because they're overly interested in the UN, but we're obviously a marker for them at the same time, and we have Syrian townships all around our OPs as well. So that in itself is unnerving. And then I guess you get to times where incidents, and now we start talking three to 4 weeks beyond October 7, when the tensions between the Syrian side of the border and the Israelis started to pick up, where through the night you would have direct fire engagements from the Israeli side onto different sites on the Syrian side, and those Syrian sites are either side of the OP, as close as a few hundred meters in some instances, and it's a bizarre feeling to know that whilst your job is to be there and to observe these actions happening, at the same time, you're trying to separate yourself going, okay, I acknowledge that the Israeli are a first world fighting force, and they're going to be pretty accurate with what they want to hit, and you kind of come to peace a little bit with that as well. But what always made me very nervous was the rocket effects that would be coming from, in essence, behind us, from the Syrian side, that are often not as competent or not as effective, and will drop short or just completely miss the intended target. So these are the kind of things that are falling in front of OPs a few hundred meters between kind of in the area of separation itself. So those instances occurring, and then Israeli indirect fire onto different sites, again within those 1,000 meters. And especially by night when these things are occurring, and it's just loud, you can't quite pick where it's coming from or where it's impacting, is a really unique experience. Rhys mentioned before the breadth of the kind of the observers that we had over there. And I remember one night we had indirect, I think it was 600 metres from the OP, 600 or 700 metres from the OP. So far enough away, but at the same time, way too close for anyone's comfort as well.
Artillery start danger close at 600 and then start walking it back in. So like you're at the start of a danger close practice with a munition you don't know, with firers that you have no idea how good they are.
Absolutely, and you can't discern where it's actually landing. And by night, the noise is enveloping, so it sounds like it's just everywhere around you. And I was with a Bhutanese officer at the time who was a doctor, and she was on the ground. She was terrified. And I look back on that and go, just kind of consider how we both reacted at the time, and it was challenging in those instances, I guess. And I'm sure Rhys has plenty of examples, especially from your time in Lebanon, where I think our training and probably professionalism, a little bit of pride as well, inoculate us a little bit in terms of reducing the danger in our mind. But at the same time, it kind of goes to show the difference of people that are being sent on that mission from who we send as a nation, as Australia, versus this Bhutanese doctor that was there with me on that particular night. And all of a sudden you're having to do your job as an observer, but also, ultimately look after your offsider who's on the floor. So, but I'm sure Rhys has plenty of examples to build on from a Lebanon side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is very interesting to work with these people from different countries. And for some of them, especially the European countries, this is their fifth mission compared to Australia, who this is some of our first missions deploying overseas. So that sort of difference was interesting. And there was definitely a level of complacency that came in across all people, I'd suggest, over an extended period of time due to the heightened level of awareness that you had on almost a daily basis. And there was almost this opinion that we were there as observers to observe the peace, but what we experienced on the ground was that there was no peace to actually observe. So it was hard to argue and sometimes encourage people to go out on patrols for a day if they felt that they were in danger or if they were concerned about a particular situation. And I know for myself, a very particular day, we were driving along, conducting a patrol, and then we came across a cache of rockets. And at the time, it was one of those situations where someone was driving the vehicle who wasn't necessarily used to driving a vehicle. Some of these countries have drivers or they're not used to driving a manual. And then having someone like that in the driver's seat was very interesting to see them try and reverse over 300 metres in densely vegetated terrain on a very tight road. And you can see the stress levels, and I definitely experienced that and wanted to get in the driver's seat myself and try and reverse out. But having to just slow down and assess the situation was a really important opportunity.
We'll talk to high awareness in a second when we go back to decompression when you come home. But the training piece is interesting. Like, did you both feel like prepared? I mean, RMC, we go through a number of different things, not specific, like you said, with Israel specifically planning for that sort of threat. But do you think that the training at RMC and subsequent training, you talked about COAC, but say LWIC and Captain's Course and ACMC, did that like prepare you as better than any other, or were there still issues?
I think for myself personally, and I'll let Major Evans speak from the RMC side a bit more, I think the training that I received at ADFA, especially Leadership Challenge 3, which is more focused on a stability operation, was some of the most beneficial training that I had to actually prepare me to operate on this sort of operation, where we were conducting patrols, key leadership engagements, observation posts. These are the exact sorts of activities that we conduct with our third-year trainees on LC3. So I think it actually really did give me the opportunity to prepare to deploy on this type of operation by giving me the confidence to operate in an unfamiliar environment and also make decisions in an environment that I'm not necessarily comfortable with or don't have all the information for. In terms of the, I suppose, Army continuum of training, it definitely helped, but what we were doing there was less focused on what we would do in regular Army on a warfighter or a TS. It was less sort of conventional warfare. It was more focused on the stability operations at a very small personal scale, where us as a one-car patrol with two people would be getting out the door and speaking to individuals on the side of the road.
I suppose back to Major Evans as well. Like, did you have confidence knowing, you talked about the doctor and experiences may vary, but you talked about the doctor and then your own experience and sort of, did you have confidence in the training that you received from RMC and then subsequently, like your decision making?
Yeah, and this is obviously not a bias given my current posting, but I do genuinely think that it's probably a byproduct of the culture that we have in our training and the ability to make a decision. And I think that's something that we're doing really well in training these days is trying to demonstrate that decision making should be a behaviour. It's not a taught skill. It should just be a behaviour that people are competent at doing. And I think that came through for a lot of us when we were over there. That in times of I guess when there are stresses, and that doesn't necessarily need to be kinetic stresses. It could just be environmental as well. I think we are all quite adept at just assessing a piece or assessing information more broadly and then just making a decision and moving with that. And probably ironically and unfortunately that goes against the grain in the UN machine as far as I'm concerned. And we were obviously warned out before we got there that there is a bit of probably cultural conflict between the Australian way of doing business and the UN, and I very much experienced that myself, where the vast majority of Australians were, I guess, go-getters in our terminology. When you talk to a 76-year-old peacekeeping operation that doesn't move quickly in any way, that sort of mindset and behaviour is challenging to balance when you have, a relatively static beast that is that mission in particular, and you're trying to make some really marked changes, especially in conflict like that. Where change needs to happen, and you just hit obstacles or obstruction. It's both frustrating and concerning because you realise that the change you're trying to make is generally linked to safety. And Rhys talked about kind of evacuation plans and things like that. And if I can kind of go down a tangent, I'll start again. When October 7 kicked off, there was a plan to move the UN mission in Syria from Camp Rhys and relocate them back into Damascus itself. And that was how it used to be pre-civil war in 2011 when that started. And that was a plan that was in kind of concept pre-war, as in pre-October 7. And that plan was pursued and pursued and pursued all the way through the conflict and up until the point that I left. And obviously since then you kind of lose a bit of situational awareness as to what's going on. But a really good example would be that plan to relocate all the observers, and again, like Rhys said, unarmed observers kicking around Damascus city, which is not the most unsafe place, but it's not safe at the same time, into an environment that is uncontrolled. There wasn't a plan to get people SIMs for their phones. There wasn't any great deal of personnel tracking set up by the UN there. Whilst that was occurring, what definitely made news here in Australia was the strike on the Iranian embassy in the middle of Damascus, and that was like 3 blocks away from where they were planning on moving the UN observers to. And this is the kind of mindset that from an Australian perspective you go, that's just absurd, and how could this happen?
Introducing considerable friction by like picking a whole contingent up and moving them to an uncertain location.
Yeah, absolutely, and exposing them to an incredible amount of risk for just really hard to justify reasons. At that given point in time, whilst that conflict was going on and there is so much tension on the border, to then pick up a UN contingent like that and drop them into the middle of the city, which is actively being targeted by the Israeli Defence Force and their Air Force in particular, weekly at that point was bizarre. But that's the kind of mindset that you have to be prepared to be comfortable with and be a part of the machine. And then going into that headquarters job.
Did the training scale up, I suppose? But
so I guess going into that headquarters job was both an incredible opportunity because I was able to balance myself across both Syrian operations from the UN perspective and Israeli operations as well. But at the same time, having to be that conduit between the Syrian government that the UN interacted with and the Israeli government that the UN interacted with was incredibly frustrating because you have 3 very different parties who have very different motivations. The Israeli is very much of the perspective that, that entire region is out to get them, and justifiably so, given the events, right? You have the Syrian side who have so much internal issues that they can't see anything outside of what is going on in their world. And then you have the UN, as we've kind of talked to already, who are just trying to, do the same thing. So maintaining a degree of safety against all these three parties was an incredible balance. But I don't think they ended up moving to Damascus in the end.
No, and this is probably a really important point to note. We both left in July 24, and from July 24 over the 3 months after that, things significantly changed within the region and things got significantly worse as well. So we probably can't speak about that from our own experience, but it is worth noting that the mission from that point absolutely did change.
So we danced around a little bit, but can you just, I suppose, provide a little bit more context on what was the perceived threat, or sort of which parties were at play in Lebanon first? I'll go to you, Rhys, and then subsequently Syria.
So from myself in Lebanon, what we were actually seeing was, within the south in particular, was a significant amount of Hezbollah. This was seen through many different ways. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with Hezbollah as an organisation, it is a political organisation that has a military wing. So this would be something similar to imagining the Labor or Liberal Party having a military wing of over 40,000 people and, tens of thousands of rocket systems as well. So they're essentially responsible for the government in southern Lebanon. And as a result, if you are a civilian within southern Lebanon and you need to see a doctor, you'll take them to a Hezbollah doctor. And that's just the way that it works down there. And a really good example to, I suppose, describe how things changed when we were there is there was a town that we would drive through and there was roughly 10,000 people there on a normal time. But once the conflict started, everyone moved out of the town, and one of the local grocery stores, the owner of the store had to shut down because there wasn't work coming into it, and as a result, he joined Hezbollah. And I think that was a really interesting perspective and insight to get to see people like that who had a normal functioning life providing a service to the community, and then as a result of the conflict had to change to working and working with Hezbollah. And this was something that we saw pretty common across the area of operations, where towns became deserted and we would often drive through them and you would see groups of fighting age males wearing black combat clothing. There would be Hezbollah flags and there would essentially only be males in the area and no females. So the best we could do was lock our doors and drive through and hope that we weren't stopped for any sort of reason. And this is something that was, I suppose, that was one threat. And throughout the duration of my time there, the UN in particular wasn't actually targeted directly. There were several different close incidents of, whether it was indirect fire or small arms damaging equipment of individuals. And that was a really interesting thing to be driving around, and then you would get a message across the network saying that everyone was to return to their base immediately. And we would then spend a period of time in bunkers. And this would be sometimes instigated by the Israeli Defense Force if they were preparing to conduct an attack, or on other occasions where you would be driving along and then you would observe a artillery strike or an airstrike, and sometimes these would be classified as firing close within 1,000 metres, and other times this would be within your area of operations. And it was quite interesting to be driving down a road and then seeing the involvement of technology in the battle space, and there would be an airstrike, and then you would see the news report of someone who'd just been hit with a Hellfire missile on a road that you'd just driven down 5 minutes before that. So that was a very interesting experience. And although UN wasn't targeted directly, to be in that level of risk and have that, I suppose, hyper level of awareness was quite interesting and made the return home quite difficult.
Because you're always on edge. With the vehicles that you're travelling in, were they the same that we used in Afghan with being like the up-armoured SUVs, or are you talking about soft-skin normal four-wheel drives?
So they were predominantly 70 series and 200 series Land Cruisers that had been up-armoured, but they were varying in their ages. So some of them were within sort of 20,000 kilometres old, others were 200,000 kilometres old. And there was instances where these vehicles would break down on the side of the road and we'd have to get recovered. And most of the time this wasn't a problem, but it was always a concern that if you had stopped or broken down in an area that wasn't considered safe, that help was a few hours away, and being unarmed military observers, we essentially had no choice but to sit there and wait in a locked vehicle. And it was unfortunately a few months before we got there was an Irish peacekeeper who was in a vehicle and they had locked it, but they were swarmed by a mob, and then one of them was killed when one of the locals put a rifle in there and shot into the vehicle. So that was always playing on the back of your mind, that there could be instances where you were stopped and you had no choice but to sit and wait. And one of the elements of risk there was the QRF was a bit of an unknown quantity, being of a different country and not necessarily knowing the level of training or how well they would be able to respond to an incident. And also English not being their primary language was also an area of concern. As if you were calling for help, it'd be very comforting to know that there was a Australian company on the way or Australian platoon, but knowing that you were going to have to work through a translator or a language assistant made it very challenging and at times somewhat concerning as well, that help would have been over an hour away.
And you can't engage yourself, right? You can't fire yourself. So you've got GPS denied, you don't have any GPS. Working on maps, so you're relying on your own individual navigation, and then subsequently you can't really do anything back. That's got to make you nervous, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was something that was just everyone sort of dealt with differently and decided what their risk threshold was. And there was multiple different occasions where there was a denial of freedom of movement. So as the UN, they have freedom of movement within the country as they've been invited there by the host country. A denial of freedom of movement would be when they were stopped in a location and not able to proceed. And this happened to me on an occasion. We were stopped by roughly 8 males, and originally it seemed somewhat hostile, but eventually it was de-escalated and it just turned into a conversation, and we weren't able to go and observe a house that had been destroyed in an airstrike and conduct an investigation on that house. So it is something that was observed, and it varied significantly in terms of how dangerous or what that risk level was for multiple different people across the rotation.
And I suppose let's throw to the 5 to 10 k's across the border to your observation post, sir. But like from Syria, dangers and threats. What have we got?
Yeah, so it was dynamic to say the least. So you have obviously the Syrian armed forces there, which are largely a very ad hoc, thrown together conscription force. Again, very poor, very basic capability. There are checkpoints all throughout the area that we were operating in, and you're talking 1 to 2 individuals, barely in uniform, and a couple of small arm weapon systems, and that's about it. And that was the fighting force of the Syrian armed forces in that area writ large. I think what created a lot of complexity is as the conflict progressed, we kind of learned, I guess, that on the Israeli side of the border, noting that their weight of effort was towards Gaza and then to the north with Lebanon as well. What then ended up on the Syrian border was a lot of the Israeli Defence Force reserve capabilities. Very, very new, very nervous Israeli Defence Force members. And that resulted in, whilst the UN was never considered the target of any of these sort of actions, that resulted in numerous firings onto UN vehicles that were operating on the Syrian side by the Israelis across those kind of few months post-October. And whilst negligible mistakes as what would be determined to later on, it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much for a mistake to become quite significant in terms of a targeting event. Israel's concern for the best part was always the proxy forces moving through Syria, and probably less so the Syrian armed forces themselves. Obviously, Syria being that buffer between Iran and Israel, and the tensions between those two nations themselves. So, whilst Israel might never have been too concerned with the Syrian armed forces and those couple of soldiers at checkpoints, it was the proxy forces that were potentially moving forward or moving through. Not that we ever saw anything of that nature or any sort of mass at all moving through those areas, but that didn't stop them being exceptionally nervous on the border there.
And I think something that we also saw in terms of a risk threshold is Israel definitely had a very low risk tolerance, where they were willing to accept an element of risk to strike targets that they wanted. And in particular, this saw something like a tank ABF being established about 50 metres from an observation post, as well as them dropping mortars within 100 metres of a UN patrol. So their targeting was exceptional, but it was somewhat concerning at times because we didn't know what the target was. And although we most likely weren't the target, they were striking them very close to UN vehicles or UN positions. And as a result, Hezbollah knew that this was a targeting dilemma for them, so they would attempt to use UN positions as a sort of shield, and it would be firing rockets or firing small arms from very close proximity to them. I know for myself, on one occasion, was conducting a visit to a Indian position where a platoon was located, and when we were there was multiple rockets fired from 200 meters by Hezbollah, likely by Hezbollah, into Israel. We immediately went to the bunker, and that was also a very interesting experience to be. And in this bunker, which was far below the standard that we would accept in Australia, and we were required to wait out there for a couple of hours until the situation had been resolved. But that was quite an interesting experience to see that Hezbollah was bold enough to fire rockets from within 200 metres of a UN position, and then also quite concerning to wait and see what the retaliation was, because there was a very clear SOP that when rockets were fired from Lebanon into Israel, the Israeli Defence Force would then retaliate normally within the next 10 to 15 minutes.
I suppose you talked about coming home. I'm like, I suppose it's coming. 12 months is a long time. Like, and you start to get. I mean, Rockles can only and leave out of country can only do so many things. But you're starting to get to the end of this sort of long deployment. Was the redeployment date unknown or very certain? Noting that it was a fixed 12 months, and then subsequently, what was it like coming back?
Yep, so we got told the rough deployment date within a few days before we went over there. So it was very comforting to know exactly when we would be coming home. I think in terms of coming home itself, it was quite a challenge from leaving what was essentially a very interesting, high-paced, potentially risky environment to coming back to Australia. I mean, I left Lebanon and within 36 hours, I was back at home in Adelaide. So I left Lebanon, went to 39 OSB, handed back my equipment, had my post-deployment psych review and medical, and then was on a plane that very same day. So for me personally, I think that it wasn't enough time given the experience that we had as a team. And it's also very important to note that the 6 of us were spread across the 3 different countries, so didn't actually get that time together to properly decompress. I think for me personally, I would have really benefited from a couple of days in AMAB, for example, to bring the team together, talk about our shared experiences, and sort of just come to terms with what we'd seen and get a better understanding of how each other was feeling. I think that would have been a really good way to get that sort of opportunity before coming home and being thrust into normal life.
AMAB being Al Minhad Air Base. I think I've only deployed with formed groups, right? So it's always very deliberate. Stage back to Al Minhad Air Base, and then subsequently some decompression back in country, all together to genuinely decompress, and then move back to your sort of some leave, and then back into your day job. Is it same? That was your experience of your exfil?
I guess coming out honestly was an individual experience. So you just talked about kind of contingent-based redeployments from an area. For us, it was very individual. We obviously came back from 3 different locations, being the 3 different countries, and so our return to Australia was in 3 very different packets at the same time. Obviously, the Lebanon and Syria crew came back together, and the Israeli crew came back by their own means. We all obviously reconvened in Sydney and through 39 OSB. But beyond that kind of 24, 48 hours, it was largely over to you in terms of so for myself, reconnecting with my family at that point and my 2 little girls was important to me, and I took a good 2 months off. But that's self-inflicted, right? Like, that's not a directed thing or recommended in any way. That was just my plan. I'm very grateful that I did that, and I think that it was appropriate for me at that point in time. But there's definitely been challenges since then in terms of just reintegrating more broadly. And like 12 months is a long time to be away. But I would also argue at the same time, it probably wasn't until the 6-month mark that I actually felt like, okay, I've got a grip of this. I'm a relative expert on this area and doing my job. So they gave me another 6 months to actually execute that plan and that function, right? So 12 months was enough time, but it was a good amount of time, and that's personal. That's a personal opinion. But yeah, coming back was an individual experience for sure.
I suppose your partner's been looking after kids for a long time, and you reintegrate and your kids are like, he's back sort of thing. What's that feeling like when you get back home?
I was very fortunate. Like, my 2 girls, they did an incredible job while I was away. We had all sorts of activities, I guess, to keep in touch and keep that connection going. And they were really good. I took a bit of time for myself just to travel and kind of just do things that were for me. But other than that, it was, I spent a good bit of time at my dad's farm in Victoria, and it was just to have peace, right? And you still, and it's bizarre because you think it's like a really like a war movie cliche in terms of like you'd hear a plane go over, and like in Syria there are no planes. There are no helicopters that go over. Like there is no air capability moving in any way. So to hear a plane go over for those first few months it was weird. And you don't think that sort of thing is going to not trigger me, but like you would pay attention to that, but you very much do. So I think everyone's kind of gone through it differently. Like I know Rhys came back and you came back to work relatively quickly, I think, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I ended up having about 10 days off after I got back, and that involved buying a car in Adelaide, driving from Adelaide to Canberra.
That's not time off. That sounds like a lot of stuff. Yeah.
And moving into an apartment in Canberra. So I think it was very quick. And for me, I prioritised getting back to work and joining in with the start of the ADFA term. Looking back on it now, I definitely don't think it was enough time to fully, I suppose, decompress from the experience that I had and also reflect on it. I sort of forced myself into work, and although it was actually an excellent experience on the ADFA side of things to come back at that time, but looking back, I wish that I'd had some more time to actually slow down, and something that I'd definitely do differently if I could. But I do think if we had sort of controlled it from more of a form body perspective, and the six of us take that deliberate time, I think that really would have been beneficial. And I know 39 OSB, they ran a decompression activity in January this year. Unfortunately, I had other plans, so I couldn't attend, but everything that I've heard from those who were there said it was a really beneficial activity and sounded like it was a really good opportunity to get the group together and discuss everything that everyone had experienced over their 12 months, as well as what they'd experienced over their 6 and 12 months when they got back, as Major Evans said, being a quite personal experience.
Yeah, I think you'd only have to go back a few rotations now, and if you were to kind of take a snapshot of everyone's reintegration, unfortunately, there are a lot of less than ideal cases, I think, is the reality. And to say otherwise would be a little bit ignorant, I think. So yeah, whilst it was an individual experience, I think it's something that going forward, especially for these particular or these operations of these nature, that we have to be really careful with. People talk about looking after each other and looking after their people as an organisation. I think this is something that is probably an area we could absolutely improve in, and especially given that really acute change over that period of time as well. So room for improvement as always, right?
No, that's right. Always dangerous with a non-structured deployment where you don't have a body of 600 troops moving in at one time. Thank you. I suppose that's your preparations, infill, and then subsequently the conditions completely changing in one of the most complex conflicts in the world, and most complex. I think your example, sir, in that headquarters of the tensions between each organisation, then amplified onto the countries, and each group inside the countries just exemplifies how difficult it is and how complex the region is. Thank you both so much for your time. It's been absolutely awesome. Thank you.
No, thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Todd.
Thanks for listening to the Cove Podcast. Explore our channel for more great audio PME content. Also, visit us at cove.army.gov.au for hundreds of additional resources. The Cove, the learning home of the Australian profession of arms.